All right, everybody. It's always good to start a little early. I said this, I think I've said this every week. I'm just amazed at the number of people. And having said that, I've been told a few times that I need to introduce myself. I just assumed all these years of trying to make all these corny jokes that everybody kind of knew who I was. And one of the reasons I never really introduced myself, Jackson, if you put that picture up, you know, this goes back to, we'll see when it gets up there. My CIA days. I was quite young. And of course, you can see my van in the background there. So it's always been hard for me to tell you who I am. Having said that, though, some 60 years later, I'm David Rejebian. My grandparents started this series in 1956, and if you do the math, this is our 68th year. So now when you all come back on a weekly basis, you'll know who I am, and I won't have to tell you anymore. We have a great program tonight, as we've had all summer long. We've had a couple of date issues with the 4th of July and Juneteenth, but now we're on a string where we're going to go from here, and we're going to go into August this year to make up for the 2 Wednesdays that we couldn't. So we have a great lineup, but we're all looking forward to tonight's program, and I'm going to introduce Trissy to welcome you, and I don't know who's going to introduce. Are you going to introduce? And Richard Stanford, who, by the way, I'm just going to tell you right now, next week is our backup, substitute, first reserve book reviewer who's going to talk to us about Bonnie and Clyde. So keep that on your calendar. Trissy?
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome each of you here on behalf of Highland Park United Methodist Church. But before I go any further and introduce myself, I'd like to thank David and Jane Rejebian right back there for doing this one more time, another year. So let's thank them. I know COVID is in the back of our minds, but it is so good seeing this place full, seeing everybody back and living a normal life again. So I'm thankful you're here. I'm Trissy Osborne. I'm in pastoral care, and I wear a few hats, as everyone that works here does, but my favorite hat is I run a dementia respite program for, obviously, people living with dementia and their caregivers. I am always looking for excellent, motivated, and fun volunteers. So call me if you're interested. We meet on Thursdays from 10 to 2. Our program is full. We have a waiting list, and it's one of the best ministries at this church, helping families living with dementia. And if you have that in your life, please feel free to contact me, and I'll try and help you in any way I can. I think when we named it Journey Ministry, we had no idea what a journey it is to be living with dementia. So I'm going to say a prayer and then turn it over to Richard. Father, we thank you for this gathering tonight. We thank you that we live in a place where we can worship freely, listen to book reviews freely, where we can do all things freely in America. Thank you for this group, their enthusiasm and their energy. You can just feel it in the room tonight. Please bless everyone here and all those that they love. In Christ's name, amen.
Now, thank everybody. It was a nice evening eating. Sorry we have to start cutting it off, but at 3:50, that's about all we can handle. The way you can adjust to that is beginning tomorrow, make your reservations for whenever, and you'll be just fine. Thank you for that. And I will say, tonight in the presentation, I feel like one of these national newscasters. Be forewarned, there may be disturbing materials. And so just be forewarned. You can close your eyes if you want to. So, but anyway, John Leake is truly a true crime writer. Entering Hades, if you have not read it, and John helped me pronounce the guy's name, I still can't do it. But, a serial killer. I mean, his books are so much fun. So if you haven't read Entering Hades, then certainly now out here at the end of this, we're going to be selling books. John will be personalizing, signing, as long as the books last. So, and excuse us again, if I grab John from the stage and take him out, it's because there's no time to talk up here. He needs to go to the signing table and be ready. You can talk to him there. So anyway, I think all that said, we've done our housekeeping. Let's introduce John. John is a graduate of Boston University, both his BA and his master's degree. He got a graduate fellowship to Vienna. Spent 9 years there as an editor, and came back here and truly began writing true crime. He's one of our really fun national writers on that issue. So I'm not going to say any more. Please welcome John Leake.
I'm hoping this microphone will work. It worked. Amazing. Thank you for coming. Thank you to David and Jane Rejebian for honoring me by inviting me to this very distinguished summer series. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's so close to where I grew up, and it's so close to where this story took place, mostly in the late 70s and early 80s. As introduced, I'm going to turn off my phone. As introduced, I'm John Leake. I was born and raised in Highland Park. I went to Bradfield Elementary and then McCullough Middle School and then Highland Park High School. I graduated in the class of 1989. I was confirmed at St. Michael Episcopal Church. I think this is the first time I've been here at the Methodist Church. I think that it's an interesting setting for this story because the anti-heroine of the book, Sandra Bridwell, professed to be very interested in the Christian faith and ultimately proclaimed herself to be a minister and missionary, which I believe to this very day she still does introduce herself to those who encounter her out in this great country of ours. People still encounter her, and she still introduces herself as a missionary, which she's not supposed to do per the terms of her probation. Sandra, she was never even subjected, in my research, to a difficult interview in connection with these mysterious violent deaths. However, in the year 2007, she was arrested in Southport, North Carolina, which lies right on the Cape Fear River. Some may remember the great film noir Cape Fear, which was based on a novel. Very interesting parallels there. Sandra was living in Southport in 2007. She ingratiated herself with an elderly widow as a missionary in between missions to Africa to tend to the needy and the sick. And she proceeded to move in with the elderly lady under the alias Camille Bowers. She then stole the widow's identity and plundered her financial accounts. She was caught for that and sentenced to aggravated identity theft. It sounds kind of like a bureaucratic offense, but in fact, it's a pretty grave federal felony. She was then released in 2010, had a year of probation in 2011, as far as I know, and I have fairly recent intelligence on her, she's still alive, and she apparently is still violating the terms of her probation, introducing herself as a missionary. But anyway, that's jumping ahead. I grew up on Lorraine Avenue, I had 3 brothers, or still do, and down the street, just down the street from us, in the year 1978, a lady freshly married to a man named Bobby Bridwell. Bobby came from Tyler, Texas, something of a oil family in Tyler, Texas. He himself had gotten out of the oil business and had became a hotel developer. In the year 1978, he married Sandra Bridwell, and they purchased a house on Lorraine Avenue just down the street from my family. I was friends with Sandra's second child, a girl named Catherine, and I enjoyed hanging out at the Bridwell house starting in the year 1983. That's when I became pretty close friends with Catherine. I was just 13 years old that summer, and the Bridwell residence was a fun place for us kids to hang out because there was never any adult supervision. Bobby Bridwell had died in the year 1982. So the year just prior to when I started hanging out at the Bridwell house with my friend Catherine, Bobby had succumbed to lymphoma. And I was not aware of this. My mother was busy raising 4 kids. My mother also had a parent who was ill with cancer. And so that occupied my mother as well. My mother did not tell me about any rumors pertaining to Sandra Bridwell. And for that matter, my mother didn't really know that I was hanging out at the Bridwell house. I point that out just because I think it's important. I knew nothing about the rumors that were swirling at the time, but there were rumors swirling at the time. And occasionally, when Sandra would come sauntering in, she drove a Mercedes 380 SL convertible, and by nice weather, the top was down. She had this real kind of razzmatazz about her. And she would pull into the driveway in her Mercedes and strut into the house, and occasionally I would bump into her. And what I can say about Sandra, as a 13-year-old boy, I had no means of evaluating her. I mean, I didn't know how old she was. Now I know she was about 38 years old. What I can say is just my impression as a 13-year-old boy. I thought she was very pretty, and she had, as I remember, this kind of porcelain skin and this kind of lustrous raven hair, and these big matching brown eyes. And what I do remember, if I were speaking about anything, no matter how trivial, she had this way of gazing at me as though what I were saying was really interesting. And that just registered in a very impressionistic way. It's just the way she comported herself was not like other mothers who seemed kind of harried with kids, I mean, most moms are sort of preoccupied. It seems like they're doing 10 different things at once and not really paying attention to some kid that happens to show up. But Sandra would really kind of focus her attention on you. And I remember that registering at the time. The other thing that's kind of funny, and I only was informed about this 30 years later, I said, it was cool that she drove a Mercedes 380 SL convertible, just a 2-seater. I always thought it was cool, kind of stylish and glamorous. No other mom drove a car like that. And a friend of mine, a female friend who is a mom, said, well, there's a reason for that. When you're a mom, you have to haul kids around. And it was only then that, I had this revelation. Okay, now I understand why that was different. Sandra was very interesting. There was something kind of mesmerizing about her. In the year 1985, I became vaguely aware that the Bridwell household had sold the house. They'd moved from their house on Lorraine Avenue to a house on Asbury Avenue, which is just right off of Hillcrest, right up just north of here. Had bought a duplex on Asbury. The children were still in the Highland Park Independent School District. But it was around that time that we went from elementary school to middle school, and I quit seeing Catherine that much. But sometime in the spring of 1986, it was just drawn to my attention that the Bridwells had just abruptly left. Sandra had pulled all three of her children out of school, and they just abruptly left. And a mutual friend said they'd moved to the Bay Area of San Francisco. And none of the kids knew why. It was just weird. It was in the middle of the spring semester. Didn't even wait, for the summer recess. Just gone. And I remember at the time thinking, well, that's kind of weird. But I don't know. And then exactly 1 year later, in May of 1987, it became apparent why Sandra had taken her three children and abruptly left the Park Cities. In May of 1987, D Magazine, our local glossy magazine here in Dallas, published a cover story called, I believe it was Death and Gossip in Highland Park. And Sandra, Catherine's mom, the kind of unusual mother down the street, she was on the front cover of the magazine. And a friend of mine sat down with me at the Highland Park High School cafeteria, and he flashes this. He said, "You are not going to believe this." And by then, I was pushing 17 years old. I was a pretty literate kid. I liked to read. My grandparents had big libraries. My parents were readers. So I was a pretty literate kid, and I remember at that time of my life enjoying Stephen King novels. So I read that D Magazine piece with great interest. And it was not explicitly stated, but the moniker that was given to Sandra in the D Magazine piece was the Black Widow of Highland Park. And so from that moniker alone, it was implied that she was apparently connected, not with one, not with two, but with three violent deaths. The first violent death that had raised suspicion of her possible involvement was that of her first husband, a man named David Stiegel. And it was in February of 1975, David Stiegel, Sandra's first husband, was found shot to death in their marital bed. Sandra told the investigating police that she had not heard anything. She was sleeping in a different room, a different part of the house, like a children's room, implying that they were estranged, that the marriage was under stress. She went into the master bedroom the next morning and saw him lying in bed in a pool of blood. The Dallas police came to the scene. They made, as I later discovered, a very cursory examination of this death scene. It was quickly ruled a suicide by the Dallas County Medical Examiner. Okay. Fast forward 7 years. In the interim, Sandra has met her husband, Bobby Bridwell. Now, this is a very interesting moment in her career. She had long shown interest in being something of a Dallas socialite. When she met Bobby, she quite quickly, at least temporarily, realized that dream. He was a very popular man in Dallas society. He was the life of the party. He had a passion for collecting thoroughbred racehorses. And he is still to this day known the crowning achievement of his career as a hotel developer. He was the guy who conceived and did all of the conceptual work on the mansion at Turtle Creek. And that really quickly, which was precisely his vision, the mansion on Turtle Creek opened in 1980 with great fanfare. The 21 Club restaurant management in New York City ran the restaurant. It quickly became a place to see and to be seen in Dallas. Professional musicians and actors that were touring would stay there. It quickly achieved this kind of air and reputation of glamour. Well, that was Bobby's vision. And it was really a great triumph for Bobby Bridwell as a developer. Unfortunately, he did not live very long to relish this great success, because the year that the mansion opened, he was diagnosed with lymphoma. While he lay dying of lymphoma, or I should say, he began to undergo a very aggressive regimen of chemotherapy to treat his lymphoma. His treating physician was a young, something of, I would describe him as a part of a Dallas medical family. He was something of a legacy doctor. His name was John Bagwell, and his father was also John Bagwell, who was the president of staff at Baylor University Medical Center in the 1960s. So John came from a medical family. He, like his father, demonstrated great acumen as a physician, and he, in many respects, became the go-to oncologist in the Park Cities. I mentioned my mother's mother was diagnosed with cancer. Dr. Bagwell was my grandmother's oncologist in the same year as he was Bobby Bridwell's. While Bobby, in spite of this excellent medical care, I would say the best at the time, it became clear in the spring of 1982 that he was not going to make it. At that moment, Sandra, by multiple witness accounts, took a fancy to Dr. Bagwell, began ingratiating herself not only with Dr. Bagwell, but with Dr. Bagwell's wife, Betsy. And Sandra introduced herself. She would bump into mutual friends in Dallas and say, "Betsy Bagwell's my new best friend." And when Bobby finally died, his funeral was held at the Highland Park Presbyterian Church. Dr. Bagwell was one of his pallbearers, and that apparently personal relationship that was developed, Sandra continued pursuing that following Bobby's death. 2 months after Bobby died, Dr. Bagwell's wife, Betsy, was found shot to death in her car parked in the short-term parking lot at Love Field Airport. Now, that was a pretty long preface, but I would like to say that as I discovered later, as I really got into my research, the death of Betsy Bagwell is really the moral and dramatic heart of this story. And I quickly recognized, just intuitively, that there were very mysterious elements of this story that had not been properly investigated. And I think I'd like to, first I'd like to ask, because I don't want to be real repetitious if a large percentage of the audience has read the book. Could I see a raise of hands? How many people have actually read the book? So pretty many. I think I'll forego doing a reading then and focus my remarks on a kind of explication. So what I realized was that there was this remarkable sort of Great Wall of China that was erected between Betsy's immediate social circle and the Dallas police. So the Dallas police and medical examiner are attempting to look at this case, but as I learned in the course of my research, there is a paucity of witness testimony coming from Betsy's friends. So when the police, their first glance at this death scene as Betsy was found at Love Field Airport, again, like Sandra's first husband, who was found shot to death in his bed just 7 years earlier, at first glance, it sort of looks like suicide. But because I would say forensic science was relatively unsophisticated back then, especially compared to the state of the science today, that and combined with the fact that none of Betsy's close circle, she actually dined with her two best friends at the Dallas Country Club, immediately preceding going to pick up Sandra to give Sandra a ride to the Dallas Country Club. Those two ladies who dined with Betsy and were completely apprised of her state of mind, her mood, the topic of conversation at lunch, which, as I later discovered, was in fact Betsy's troubles with Sandra. Those two ladies never spoke with the Dallas police. And as I discovered towards the end of my research, and now I'm going to jump ahead. So Betsy's death was ruled a suicide. And then about 2 years later, in the summer of 1984, and this was, interestingly enough, around the time that I was hanging out with Catherine. But I never met this young man. I was not aware of the role he played in this story. A young man, 29 years old, named Alan Rarig, from Edmond, Oklahoma, a suburb of Oklahoma City. In June of 1984, he had just arrived in Dallas the day before. And some guys at his commercial mortgage real estate company said, if you're looking for a place to stay and you don't want to live in an apartment complex, you might go check out Highland Park. Some of the people there have a sort of carriage house or garage apartments. Maybe you could find a garage apartment. So imagine this, you're 29 years old. You've just arrived in Dallas the day before. You've never driven to Highland Park. Now, we all know that Highland Park has probably the lowest homicide rate probably in the world. Okay. So you've just arrived the day before. You drive down the 4300 block of Lorraine, and you happen to fortuitously encounter the only, what I believe that the evidence that I present in my book supports my belief, Alan Rarig happened to bump into a serial killer. He said he saw this kind of enchanting-looking woman, I think, watering her azalea bushes, and he felt drawn to her. He pulls over, he parks his vehicle, he gets out, he goes and he says, well, I'm looking for garage apartments. Might you know of one? And she says, well, and I can just imagine the scene. She says, well, I don't know of any garage apartments, but if you want to come back in a few minutes, I'll show you around. So she goes to freshen up. He comes back a few minutes later, and they go on a tour of Highland Park. And they drive down Lakeside Avenue and the Dallas Country Club. And the way she talks about herself, she gives Alan the impression that she is very integrated in this privileged, affluent society. Unbeknownst to him, in fact, at that moment, and this is 2 years after the death of Betsy Bagwell, at that time, Sandra was actually heavily ostracized. But it's a very eerie moment in this story because he has no means of knowing that. Remember, he's from Edmond, Oklahoma, and he's just arrived the day before. So I found that chapter of the book, or that chapter of the true story, to be, I don't know if anyone remembers the Billy Wilder film Double Indemnity. It has this kind of film noir feeling about it. This, unbeknownst to the naive young man, a formidably dangerous woman, and he has no idea what he's getting himself into. A whirlwind romance ensues. She tells him that she's pregnant. He, being a good Christian boy from Edmond, Oklahoma, does the honorable thing and proposes marriage. They marry at the mansion on Turtle Creek on December the 7th. Is that right? Yes, excuse me, December the 8th, 1984. Pastor Clayton Bell from the Highland Park Presbyterian Church is the presiding minister of the ceremony. Now, I wish Pastor Bell were alive because I would ask him, why did you confer your prestige and status by presiding in this? You knew, and he certainly did know, in my opinion, that Sandra was not fit for holy matrimony. So it's a strange thing that he agreed to. I think if I were Pastor Bell, I would have found an excuse. But anyway, they marry on December 8th, 1984. Exactly 1 year later, on the eve of the 1 year wedding anniversary, by then they're estranged. Alan is living with a friend. That evening, he runs out to run an errand with Sandra, whom he's not seen in a month. He runs out to run an errand with Sandra. He tells his friend with whom he's living at the time, I'm just dashing out to meet her. He said they're going to a storage warehouse in Garland to get some things, either put some things into the storage warehouse or to pull some things out of it. He never returns. His body is then found parked in his own vehicle near the Oklahoma City airport 4 days later. He's wearing the same clothing that he was wearing when he dashed out to meet Sandra. He's been shot twice. Once the shots fired from the right, one into his right torso. And then the second shot, it appears someone has then manhandled him out of the driver's seat onto the back floorboard of the vehicle with his legs between the front bucket seats and fired a second shot into the back of his head. So there's no confusing this with with suicide. He's clearly been murdered. And the Oklahoma City police get the case. And they quickly ascertain, well, okay, he seems to have been from Oklahoma originally, but his vehicle has got Texas plates, and the vehicle traces to an address in Dallas, Texas. And they really have no idea initially what they're dealing with. They think that perhaps the wife of the decedent could assist. She actually flies up to Oklahoma City to attend his funeral. She stops by the Oklahoma City Police Department to give an interview, and the Oklahoma City police detectives quickly sense there's something really strange going on with this woman. Just the way she comports herself, she's flirting with the cops. They just get a weird vibe. And then they start receiving anonymous phone calls from people in Dallas saying this wife of Alan Rarig has a past. Now, what was particularly strange and disturbing about this, and this is where I think perhaps the most sympathetic character in the book comes in, Alan's mother, Gloria, also knew nothing about Sandra and remained completely ignorant about Sandra and her past until her son turned up shot, at which point Gloria, starts receiving calls saying, there are things about your son's wife that, you need to know. Naturally, Gloria asked herself, might someone have warned Alan before it was too late? And that is, I think, a particularly troubling aspect of this story. Alan kind of was led to slaughter, and no one, gave him any kind of warning. Naturally, Gloria was completely shocked, and for those who have read the book, this turns into quite a contest between Gloria and Sandra. When I got really interested in circling back to this story, so as I mentioned earlier, I'd read the D magazine cover story in 1987 with great interest. Even at the time, I thought it seems like a strange story, particularly like there are elements to this that don't really add up. I noticed in the D magazine reporting, particularly the brief passage pertaining to the death of Betsy Bagwell, that there was a kind of redacted feeling about it. There was no quote from the widower, from Dr. Bagwell. He had apparently not spoken with the lead reporter. There were multiple persons that were referred to as the two women or the two females with whom Betsy had lunch at the Dallas Country Club. And you think, I thought, well, do they have names? A private investigator hired. Well, who hired him? It was as though, and it's remarkable that I noticed this at the time, it's as though as much was being redacted from the reporting as was being included in the reporting. And so when I re-engaged with this story, it was after Sandra was arrested in North Carolina in 2007. I actually flew out to Raleigh-Durham. I attempted to interview Sandra in pretrial detention. It's kind of an interesting moment in the book, my attempt at interviewing her. But that's when I re-engaged, and I quickly perceived something is being concealed in the matter of Betsy Bagwell. And that really became the most difficult aspect of this book to research. People did not want to talk about this. And again, I would get someone on the phone, they would become very defensive. And it wasn't as though I was a complete stranger, because my family knew all of these people who I was calling. It wasn't like I was just some reporter out of the blue. I had social connections with these people. And again, I was met with the phrase, I don't think that this should be dredged up. The Bagwell family doesn't wish to dredge this up. Everybody used that metaphor, to dredge. To dredge is to, the literal meaning is when you go and you dig out a ship harbor or a channel to excavate mud. And so you hear in the metaphor, you're digging into something that you shouldn't. This is better off left alone. And that's when I began to realize, all right, now I'm beginning to get the picture of why our little tight-knit society was not fully forthcoming with the police at the time that the investigation of Betsy's death was open. However, I did learn, the further I got into my research, that the Oklahoma City police, when they came to Dallas to investigate the murder of Alan Rehrig 3 years after Betsy was killed, Oklahoma City police detectives interviewed Dr. John Bagwell. Now, you can imagine at that moment it's pretty shocking. So, Sandra is the last known contact of Betsy. When Betsy shot 3 years later, Oklahoma City police show up and say, well, Sandra Bridwell, that woman who was the last known contact of your wife, her husband was just found shot. Last known contact with Sandra. So it's pretty clear from the interview transcript that Dr. Bagwell was pretty shocked. And he demonstrates a candor in this transcript, this interview with the Oklahoma City police detectives. Remember, this is 3 years later, in which he states, I knew, not I deduced, not I inferred. I knew that Sandra was instrumental in my wife's death. And so when I read that, I got the strong impression that he was demonstrating a level of candor in his interview with the Oklahoma City police in '86 that he did not show in his initial interview with the Dallas police in 1982. And I believe that the totality of circumstances reveals that there's no question Sandra Bridwell murdered Betsy Bagwell. And I wanted to show a brief video clip. I put this together. I should start by saying that the key element of my forensic investigation, I knew that I had to obtain the original death scene photos of Sandra's first husband, David Stiegel, and then of Betsy Bagwell. And I knew if I could obtain those photographs, unredacted, in other words, you can see everything in the photograph. A lot of times police records departments will give you photos with whiteout all over them so you can't see anything. And that's what they originally did to my first submission. I followed up. I finally persuaded the police to give me unredacted photos. I knew if I could obtain those, I could show them to modern forensic experts with very up-to-date training in the cutting-edge science of forensic investigations. And I happen to know what I think is probably the greatest in terms of both academic training and experience, a lady named Dr. Lynn Harold. She was the head of the physical evidence section of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Forensic Sciences Bureau for about 32 years. And so as you can imagine, LA County, there's no shortage of violent crime to forensically analyze. Lynn is probably best known. She served as an expert witness in the murder trial of the music producer Phil Spector. And Lynn testified that the forensic evidence showed that Mr. Spector had in fact murdered this young woman. Spector and his hired, I would call them hired gun forensic scientists, they claimed that the young lady had shot herself. Lynn said the evidence, the bloodstain patterns, the angle of the shot, there were a number of key pieces of physical evidence that demonstrated that Mr. Spector had in fact murdered this woman. And it was Lynn's testimony that I think really carried the day with the jury. So I happen to know Lynn Harold from my first book about a Viennese serial killer. who happened to get on a plane in the summer of 1991, fly from Vienna to Los Angeles. While he was in Los Angeles, he murdered 3 women in Los Angeles, and Lynn did the forensic scientific analysis of these cases. So I met Lynn in the course of researching my first book. I obtained photos of husband 1, David Stiegel, and then Betsy Bagwell, and I showed them to Lynn. And that was really the beginning of piecing together a physical evidence exhibit showing that neither Sandra's first husband nor Betsy Bagwell committed suicide. In fact, another party was involved in these deaths. Someone else was present and manipulated the crime scene. These are what we call staged suicides. The evidence shows this. Now, these are a bit gory. How about a show of hands? Can you guys handle a little gore, or shall I? Okay, all right. All right, be careful what you wish for. You might get it. All right. So this is husband 1. I hope the audio works. It's never worked the first time, but maybe we have a good AV guy here. The tradition of no volume continues. Okay, here we go. Can we get some volume?
The main thrust of my research was to re-examine those earlier deaths.
Here we go.
And what I did was I obtained the original death scene photographs and had those evaluated by contemporary forensic
All right, I don't know what
experts
just happened.
trained in the most up-to-date methods of bloodstain pattern analysis, crime scene investigations, to get a second opinion about these photographs.
Can we dim the lights? Dim the lights, please.
What you just saw was the position in which David Stiegel was found. There's a sequence of photographs. The first 2 in the police sequence, the cover was drawn up over his left hand lying on the weapon. So the police had to pull the cover back. Observe a few things here. I have a Gillette Track 2 razor in my right hand. I have the razor blade here on the sheet. This is how David Stiegel was found. He has these 3 slashes on his arm. These are rather shallow cuts, these 2 here. This one here is deep. It's a deep wound. There's also a transfer stain right here, at this point here. Notice the hand placement here on the weapon. Okay, this is the exact same weapon, the Ruger Mark I target pistol. We know that David's right arm never moved at all. It's very clear from the bloodstain pattern. His right arm never moved. If we're arguing, as the medical examiner at the time claimed, that this was suicide, if it's suicide, it could only mean, because he only has his left hand to work with, we're making the proposition that he got into bed with a loaded, it's loaded and cocked, so he's prepared this weapon, loaded it, cocked it in order to shoot himself, but he, a doctor with 1 year of anatomy at the Baylor School of Dentistry, takes as well this Gillette Track 2 razor in addition to the loaded weapon with him to bed. Before he shoots himself, he makes these 3 incisions. This is if we're arguing suicide. The first thing that I thought with respect to this is He knows that this is going to have no lethal effect. He knows from his anatomy training the radial artery is quite deep in this section of the arm. Where the radial artery comes up close is here where you take the pulse. He's had this training in medicine and dentistry. So if David wants to make the incision to lethal effect, he would start here at the radial artery. These 3 incisions had no lethal effect. The only thing that they would have done is cause pain and distress. So we're saying if it's suicide, he brought all of this to bed with him, he made these incisions, as he well knew, they didn't kill him, he didn't bleed out. So then he sets the razor blade down. Notice that there's no blood visible on the razor blade, and there's no blood visible on his thumb or his fingers. You will note that the wound in the middle is quite deep. So even if he's holding this in a very skilled, dexterous way, it's very hard for me to imagine that he wouldn't have gotten blood on the razor blade. There's also no blood on the sheet. Okay, so he's done this, it hasn't worked. Right arm never moves, you can see clearly from the bloodstain pattern. So it's not that he got frustrated and decided, oh dear, now I'm gonna have to get out of bed and find that pistol. He's already brought the pistol with him. This is heavy, it weighs 2.2 pounds. The medical examiner found from the tattooing and gunshot pattern that this was not a contact wound. So I consulted with Dr. John Garavaglia. She found this the most suspicious of all. Statistically speaking, suicides, they almost always rest the barrel on the temple, not only because it's a lot more comfortable, but to have that surety of aim. According to the medical examiner, this was not a contact wound. It was a close-up wound of entrance, so no muzzle contact. Again, following the logic of suicide, he can't really be sure of his aim, but we're claiming that he held the pistol away from his temple for whatever reason. Squeezes the trigger, the .22 caliber long rifle bullet goes clear through his head. It's found in a blood clot adhering to the pillow. There's an exit wound on the right side of his head. After firing the shot, he continues holding the weapon, places it here on the bed, removes his finger from the trigger guard, removes his hand from the grip, and then places his hand on the weapon here. And then, for mysterious reasons, we find that the cover is then drawn up over this. This is highly improbable. The instant the bullet shot through his brain, his left arm, suspending the pistol over his head, would have simply fallen, and his left hand would have released the gun. He wouldn't have continued grasping it and extended it almost an arm's length from his head. Now, the wounds on his arm, they are ante-mortem. So these were administered before he stopped breathing. However, we know from the blood droplets around his nose that he continued breathing for some time after the shot was fired. There are blood droplets that went into his nose and were ejected from his nose. It's very, very clear in the photos. So you had ante-mortem bleeding here on his arm, but we also know that he continued breathing after he was shot. These are all details that I examine in my book. The totality of all of these elements indicate that this was not a suicide. He's lying in bed in a comfortable sleeping position wearing his pajamas when someone else fired the shot through his head. The culprit then smoothed out the covers on the right side of the bed, tucked the comforter along the back side of his legs, and staged it to look like a suicide. He's lying in bed in a comfortable sleeping position wearing his pajamas when someone else fired the shot through his head. The culprit then smoothed out the covers on the right side of the bed, tucked the...
Okay. So what's interesting about all of this is that it was really, it's really the first glance at this that gives it away that it's not a suicide. He's tucked in. Lynn Harold said someone has tucked him in. And then I talked to another guy I know. He was an FBI profiler. He was one of the founding guys of the behavioral sciences unit. And he said he sees this frequently. It's an expression of some previously intimate relationship between the victim and the culprit. There's this kind of bang, oh my goodness, I can't believe I just did that, and a kind of instinctive kind of making the victim comfortable. He said he's seen that repeatedly. So that's David Stiegel. And I stress it's the totality of circumstances indicate, and I want to point something out. This is important. By Sandra's own admission, there was no other adult in the house that night. And furthermore, she never claimed, and there was no evidence of a forcible entry. So once you realize, when you look at all of this, and of course there was motive as well, she inherited the entire estate and a significant life insurance death benefit. All of this, I believe, shows that, in my opinion, it's my belief. I mean, I believe, moreover, this should be reopened by the Dallas County District Attorney's Office. But in my belief, the totality of evidence shows that David Stiegel was in fact murdered, and there were, by Sandra's own admission, there was no one else in the house that night. So we've got just 6 minutes left. I wanted to conclude by showing a presentation of physical evidence in the case of Betsy Bagwell.
The house of Betsy Bagwell.
Can we dim the lights again?
Her husband was a man named Dr. John Bagwell. He was a very prominent doctor in Dallas, a kind of young, youthful star cancer doctor. In the year 1980, he began treating Bobby Bridwell, Sandra's second husband, for cancer. Bobby, nevertheless, in spite of Dr. Bagwell's treatment, died of cancer in 1982. 2 months after Bobby Bridwell succumbed to lymphoma, Betsy Bagwell, the wife of the oncologist John Bagwell, was found shot to death in her car at Love Field Airport. She was last seen alive leaving this house in her car with Sandra Bridwell to give Sandra Bridwell a ride to Love Field Airport. A few hours later, Betsy Bagwell is found in the short-term parking lot at Love Field, shot to death in her car. Last known person to have seen her alive was Sandra Bridwell. This is not exactly what the short-term parking garage looked like in the day. It's more or less the same. I was able to get the police incident report and the photographs. They are the key pieces of documentary evidence of what really happened in this case. It was the guy that found Betsy in her vehicle was a Mercedes-Benz mechanic. His name is Lloyd Durrett. Pulled up next to this powder blue Mercedes station wagon, and he said to his children who were along for the ride, one of these days I'll save up enough to get a family car like that. And that prompted the curiosity of his children, who then went and peered into it, and they saw the body of a woman lying across the center console. Her entire upper body was on the right, the passenger seat. Her head was actually bumping the passenger side door. The one thing that you'll notice about this garage is you think, well, it's a crowded parking garage. You know, surely there's a lot of people around, but you'll notice you can't see very well into these vehicles. There's this kind of glare from the overhead lighting. I don't think anyone is aware right now that I'm here. I don't think anyone sees me. It's full, but as we stand here and look around, there's no one around. Had it not been for Lloyd's children, who were curious about the car, who walked up to look at it, these little kids that are about this high, who knows when Betsy's body would have been found? Her car did not have this large center console, so this is not ideal. But she's found with both legs and hips on the right side of the steering wheel, and her head all the way over like this. So if this door were to close, it would actually be in contact with her head. And the pistol is wedged between her thigh and the gear shift. Like the David Stiegel death scene, there are very clear elements of staging in this. Her body was obviously moved after the shot was fired. The right hand braced between the thigh and the gear shift. This was clearly manipulated by someone else. The parking ticket for Love Field, it's stuck down between the muzzle and the laminated ashtray cover. That is another piece of staging. And the timestamp on the parking ticket is what the police used to reconstruct the timeline of Betsy's death. Glaring thing that's noted in the medical examiner field agent's report is that there's blood spatters in the back seat. He notes that in his report. Following the logic of suicide, the bucket seat has these lateral supports. Had she shot herself in the head, we would not expect her to have held on with the weapon and then have it be found braced between her thigh and the gear shift like this. She just dropped the weapon, it would be found next to her, something like that. And she would have just slumped down into the seat. Slumped down in the seat just almost like you're falling asleep or something.
Okay.
Okay, and then I'm just going to put some lateral pressure on you. And you can see how your leg is getting hung on the bottom of the steering wheel.
Yeah.
And then your head is not nearly as far over on the passenger seat.
And my left thigh's still stuck there under the wheel.
Okay. All right, now, how much effort is involved in scooting all the way over and getting your thighs and hips to clear? Yeah.
I think that might be.
Okay. So you actually had to sort of shift around, didn't you?
Yep.
The other thing that we can talk about, and that's clearly displayed in the photos, the bloodstain patterns in this case, okay? Blood has dropped down onto her right thigh, okay? So at some point she was sitting in this position. Blood dropped either from her nose or from the gunshot wound onto her right thigh. It then ran down her right thigh and dried. When she was found, you can clearly see that the blood had run in this direction and dried, but when she's rotated to the right, the blood appears to be running uphill, which we know is impossible. This is a unambiguous proof that her body was moved well after the shot was fired and the blood dried. How on earth did law enforcement not recognize this string of violent deaths as murders and arrest the rather obvious culprit? In my book, The Meaning of Malice, I present evidence that the Dallas County medical examiners got it horribly wrong. In fact, David Stiegel and Betsy Bagwell did not commit suicide, but were murdered. And their murders were part of the same series that included Sandra's third husband, Alan Raring. In the final analysis, the totality of circumstances leads me to believe that Sandra Bridwell, who's still alive, is an officially undetected serial killer.
Well, we're just about out of time. I think it's appropriate, this being a Christian institution, to point out something that I think is a theme that affects all of us. It's probably the hardest thing for all of us to do as we go through life, starting in childhood, going all the way up to the end. It is telling the truth, even when telling the truth exposes us to great discomfort and brings us into conflict. It's still better to tell the truth and get it out there than to let the truth be swept under the carpet or under the bed, where it just becomes a bigger and bigger monster or dragon that with greater and greater ramifications and damages to all involved. So I'll end, it's kind of cheating because he was a great literary stylist, but with a fellow Texas author, Cormac McCarthy. The stories get passed on and the truth gets passed over, as the saying goes, which I reckon some would take as meaning that the truth can't compete. But I don't believe that. I think that when the lies are all told and forgot, the truth will be there yet. It don't move about from place to place, and it don't change from time to time. Thank you very much.
Okay. John, thank you very much. What a great story. And I think the only place blood runs uphill was at Casa Magnetica at Six Flags in the 60s and 70s. Listen, we're glad you came. Richard Stanford is going to keep us on this road of murder and mayhem next week with Bonnie and Clyde. And once again, John Leake, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming.